And we are very happy to be joined, as we continue the show, by Ali Abunimah, who is the director of the Electronic Intifada, electronicintifada.net, for those of you looking to go check that out. Ali, thank you so much for being back with us.
Thank you, Eugene. It's always a pleasure.
You know, Ali, I'm curious what you're making of where this investigation saga is going vis-a-vis Shireen's assassination. I mean, it seems relatively clear what happened. I mean, obviously the State Department sort of dissembling, but Axios had a report earlier today that now Blinken is telling the Israelis that they want to see some quote-unquote form of accountability. So I don't know. I'm just curious some of your thoughts about where we are right now.
Yeah. Well, on May 11th, early in the morning in Jenin, Shireen Abu Akleh, world famous and beloved and very professional journalist, was assassinated by a sniper with a very accurate headshot. Immediately, Israel tried to blame Palestinians. That narrative quickly fell apart. It became clear very quickly that she was shot by Israeli soldiers who were in the area. There was no exchanges of fire in the area. There were many eyewitnesses, including Shireen's colleagues who were right with her when she was killed. The only people who could have done this, the people who did do it, were the Israeli army. Why they did it, we don't know. We don't know the motive. It's clear she was killed deliberately. Whether they intended to kill a journalist or to kill Shireen Abu Akleh specifically, we don't know that yet. But we do know how she was killed, and the eyewitnesses are clear. Since all of the, yeah.
Well, Ali, I wanted you. Sorry, go. I wanted you. You're probably going to go into this. I was going to ask you about the recent statement by the U.S. State Department that actually tried to place the blame, despite what Eugene just said, tried to actually called it tragic and tried to place the blame on terror attacks against Israelis and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, like doing whatever it is they do in Jenin, and they had the Can you please talk about the sort of context around what was taking place?
I want to get exactly to that. So my point is, all of this became very clear very quickly. And immediately, the goal for both Israel and the United States was never an investigation, never a genuine investigation, never an independent investigation, because they knew what the results would be. They knew the results would find that Israel committed this crime. So the goal from the beginning has been how to get Israel off the hook. So in the meantime, between that State Department statement of last weekend, of July 4th, actually, they issued it on July 4th, and the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, there have been at least 7 credible, independent investigations that have been carried out by Israeli human rights group B'Tselem, Al-Haq, the Palestinian human rights group, CNN, Bellingcat, NATO government-funded Bellingcat, not exactly, people who we would generally rely upon, but even they concluded that Israel did it. The Associated Press, the Washington Post, and the New York Times all concluded that Israel did this. At least 7 different investigations. The U.S. government pressured the Palestinian Authority to hand over the bullet on the basis that the U.S. is some kind of independent arbiter here. And what they did instead was they issued this statement on July 4th saying, yeah, it looks like the Israelis did it, but we have no reason to believe it was intentional, and the bullet is too mashed up to really find out more. So what are you going to do? What are you going to do? It's tragic. And as you said, Rania, they tried to implicitly blame the Palestinians, not by saying Palestinians shot her. They couldn't get away with that. But to say, well, the Israelis were in Jenin because they have to fight terrorism. So some vague justification. The reality, of course, is that Israeli occupation soldiers have no business in Jenin. They were attacking Palestinians in an occupied territory. And as I said, and all the investigations and the eyewitnesses concluded, there was no fighting in the area. There was no exchanges of fire. This wasn't a crossfire that she was caught in. So the outrage at the crude attempt by the Joe Biden administration and Secretary of State Antony Blinken to try to cover up this crime in such a crude way caused such outrage, particularly, of course, from Shireen Abu Akleh's family, who expressed in very poignant terms their disgust at this American whitewash. I think that's what explains why today Blinken, they leaked through their friendly media sources, through Axios, that Blinken told Israel that the U.S. wants accountability. That doesn't mean anything at all. That's just empty words. What I think it's now 80 members of Congress, and that's pretty remarkable. 80 members of Congress have called for is an FBI investigation into the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, an American citizen. And remember, that's routine around the world. When U.S. citizens are killed in terrorist attacks or different circumstances, the FBI will investigate. And the U.S. will assert jurisdiction in many cases and bring people extradite people to put them on trial, or at the very least insist that the countries where the crime took place put them on trial. The exception seems to be Israel, because Shireen isn't the only U.S. citizen killed by the Israeli army this year even. In January, Omar Assad, a 78-year-old grandfather who spent the last 40 years in Milwaukee, raising a family, running grocery stores, being a good U.S. citizen, retired back home to Palestine, to the West Bank, and was brutally killed by the Israeli army. And his family, too, have been demanding that the U.S. government, the Department of Justice, investigate his killing, because just like in the case of Shireen Abu Akleh, the Israeli government whitewashed it and covered it up and exonerated its soldiers, and the U.S. government has done nothing. And if I can just say one more thing to really tie in Shireen Abu Akleh's murder by Israel. Remember, the United States goes around the world lecturing everybody about the importance of the free press and the media and journalism, and crying about journalists in Hong Kong and in China and in Russia and who knows where else. And look how the US treats journalists. They're willing to allow an American journalist, Shireen Abu Akleh, to be murdered by Israel. They're willing to allow Jamal Khashoggi, a US resident and a Washington Post columnist, to be murdered by the Saudi crown prince. Remember, the CIA concluded that Mohammed bin Salman, the Saudi crown prince, personally approved the horrifying murder and dismemberment of Jamal Khashoggi. And these two killings are being brushed under the carpet because Joe Biden is planning a trip to Saudi Arabia and to Israel in a few days' time, and the U.S. wants all this swept under the rug so that when Joe Biden goes to basically beg the Saudis to produce more oil, to bring gas prices down so that the Democrats can avoid a wipeout in November, these journalists' lives have to be sacrificed for that. And let's, of course, remember, very important, Julian Assange, who is being persecuted by the Joe Biden administration. They're trying to put him in prison for the next 175 years for the so-called crime of letting the world know about U.S. war crimes. So I want to put this horrifying attempted cover-up of Shireen's murder into the bigger context of the Joe Biden administration and the United States government's utter contempt for the lives of journalists.
You know, you mentioned Joe Biden going to sort of kiss the ring in Saudi Arabia. We also hear that there was this like secret meeting held recently in Egypt between all of these countries that have normalized with Israel, as well as Saudi Arabia, which has not officially done it. Their military heads meeting with the Israelis. You hear talk of a so-called Arab NATO. The U.S. really trying to create this sort of Israeli-led security infrastructure in the region against Iran. I'm curious, what are your comments about the idea of a so-called Arab NATO as it relates to Joe Biden's upcoming meeting in Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, these reports have been floating around for a few weeks. And I mean, what we know for a fact is that it's been, it's an explicit US goal to corral all these client regimes into, an alliance against Iran, targeting Iran. And these client regimes, which really have no popular base or viability on their own, are totally dependent on US protection. The new twist here is to openly bring Israel into this alliance. Of course, many of these Arab tyrannies, these US-backed Arab tyrannies, have long been, in covert, not just diplomatic ties with Israel, but even military and intelligence ties. But what they want to do is bring this into the open. So there's been a talk floated of a joint air defense system between Israel and various Gulf regimes. And of course, the King of Jordan recently said that if there was, an Arab NATO, he would be the first to welcome it. So these are all very brittle and fragile regimes which depend on US protection. And I think the fear that some of them have, what's not clear to me is how much of this is coming from the US. I mean, the US already has all these regimes in their pocket. So the US doesn't necessarily need to formalize this in the form of an Arab NATO. The question is how much of this is coming from the regimes themselves who feel that they need some kind of formal guarantees, because as the US fades as an imperial power and regional hegemon, they really have no guarantee that the US will come to their rescue. I think they all took the lesson from what happened in Afghanistan when the American puppet regime of Ashraf Ghani collapsed immediately, and the US was able to do absolutely nothing to prop it up and to save Ashraf Ghani from that Saigon moment. And that's what I think they all fear. They all fear their own Saigon moment. And the idea of an Arab NATO, which of course would have Israeli backing and American backing, the United States would have to be the backbone of such a force, would perhaps provide them with some reassurance that if their people rise up against them, that they would have some backing, or if they were to be attacked, presumably by another state. Although I have no idea who that would be, since Iran has no history of aggression against these states, despite the propaganda, and is in fact under constant attack by Israel, the United States, and their proxies. So I read it as being more about these regimes' fears for their security more than anything else, and really formalizing the full integration of Israel and dominance of Israel over the region.
I think that's an extraordinarily important point. And I mean, I wonder, how you think it impacts on the negotiations around the Iran deal, because at least in the beginning, it seemed that there was some momentum in the Biden administration to try to, see if they could come to terms. I just happened to see Mohammad Morandi talk about what Iran is putting forward. Seems pretty straightforward in that sense, but it feels that the Biden administration is almost now kind of kind of dropped it. Like almost as soon as the Russia-Ukraine conflict started, they went back to their sort of old concept of, maximum pressure and all these other things coming together. Do you think it's because many of their client states are in many ways pressuring them to not enter into any sort of agreement with Iran?
Yeah, I think politics is involved there. I think basically the Biden administration, whether they want to or not, knows that they could sign it's not a question of signing a deal. Let's remember that the United States reneged on the deal. The United States violated the JCPOA, the Trump administration, and Joe Biden said he would return to it and has refused to do so. So it is the US that is out of compliance. And Iran has always expressed its willingness to return and has been negotiating on that basis in good faith. But the Iranian position is very clear and understandable. It's like, what guarantee do we have that, in 2 years' time, when there's a new administration, the US isn't just going to rip it up all again? I think Iran would be foolish to sign a deal without those kinds of guarantees, which I think in the United States could only come in the form of Senate ratification of an international agreement. And we know that that's politically impossible in this country. But the Biden administration doesn't want to say it, doesn't want to admit that they have no intention of rejoining the JCPOA, so they're trying to throw the blame on Iran. And yesterday, Blinken, the Secretary of State, announced a whole raft of new sanctions against Iran, and made this incredible statement that Iran is refusing to return to compliance, when it was never Iran who left the deal in the first place. And Iran's gradual reduction in compliance is part of the deal. It's Iran's protection mechanism as part of the deal, that if the other parties renege, as the United States has done and also the Europeans have done, because they've broken all their promises to Iran, then Iran has the right, within the terms of the agreement, to reduce its compliance. So if the US wants Iran to return to the deal, what it has to do is the US has to return to compliance. But Joe Biden isn't going to do that. And so he's simply trying now to cast the blame, to blame Iran and say, oh, well, we tried, but Iran, big bad Iran doesn't want to do it. And I think it's very clear as well that from the very beginning, Israel has been pushing, and Yair Lapid, who's the new prime minister, supposed centrist, and others, they've all been against it. In Israel, there's a consensus against this deal. And so the pressure on the Biden administration from Israel and from the client regimes is also there as well. So I think it's very, someone like Dr. Mohammed Marandi is obviously much more expert on this. But, from me being some steps away, I think I would be very surprised if that deal survives.
Yeah, and speaking, since you mentioned Yair Lapid, and now Israel has once again another prime minister. So I feel like Israel so much in common with Lebanon in that case, just constantly changing governments these days. But he's been kind of running around making these threats against both Iran as well as Lebanon. He went to, he met with the leader of France recently and asked him, please intervene in Lebanon to make sure that they can't explore their own gas fields. They belong to us. Please make sure there's no Iran nuclear deal. And it's just going to mommy and daddy and asking them, to make sure that you get to be the most popular kid in the region. But all that said, and also we are in the summertime. I notice, a lot of people in Lebanon get nervous about the summertime because there's been wars in the summer before. So every summer, everyone's like, oh, there's going to be a war. There's going to be a war. But the Israelis are making a lot of threats. Do you foresee any sort of looming war between the Israelis and Hezbollah or the Israelis and Gaza again? Or do you think for the time being, they've been momentarily deterred?
The deterrence is there. And let me come back to that. But what I want to say, which is an important contextual point for this issue, is that the Europeans, have, they imposed, the US and the Europeans imposed these massive sanctions on Russia, on Russian oil, and they thought that, they would bring Russia to its knees very quickly, and it has brought them to their knees, while Russian oil revenues, by all accounts, are reaching record levels. And the sanctions seem to have had no real impact on Russia, while European economies are, on the threat of on the edge of the worst catastrophe since World War II, according to German officials, because they're facing the possibility of having to shut down entire industrial sectors of the German economy if the Russian gas supply is further reduced. And Rania, you had that fantastic discussion I highly recommend on your show with Kostas Lapavitsas, the Greek economist and former lawmaker, pointing out that really Germany is the industrial heart of Europe. Other than Germany, Europe really doesn't have much sort of heavy industry. So the catastrophe that is looming there is really great. And they have made this pledge to replace Russian gas completely within X number of years. Whether that's feasible or not, I don't know. But who is key to that? Israel. Because the gas fields in the Eastern Mediterranean is what the EU has its eye on. And so they're talking about, the EU just took this decision, which just shows you how cynical everything is, where they have declared nuclear power and quote unquote natural gas, which makes it sound nice, but it's fossil gas. It's no different than oil. They have declared them to be sustainable and therefore green resources so that they can justify new investments in them. And Israel is central to this. And remember, back in May, Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, warned Israel very clearly not to go into the gas fields that are on the disputed boundary, and that Hezbollah would not be afraid to defend the gas fields, that it had the capability to do so. And I think Israel takes those words very, very seriously. And the difficulty for Israel is whether or not there is, Hezbollah has to actually implement that security guarantee for Lebanon's gas fields. The reality is that, if you're an international firm or an insurer who insures that kind of operations, are you going to go in and develop those fields when this very capable, very determined, and very credible military resistance organization, Hezbollah, is saying, we're not afraid to intervene if we have to? Right. So that's why I think there is this renewed focus on Hezbollah, because its defense of Lebanon's gas fields is very credible to them, and it stands in the way, potentially, of this this Euro-Atlantic Israeli effort to use Eastern Mediterranean gas to try to replace Russian gas and therefore weaken Russia. So that's the context in which I see those, the Israeli whining and complaints about Hezbollah, because we know that Israel cannot defeat. Yes, we know Israel can inflict horrifying damage on Lebanon. They've done it so many times, but they cannot defeat Hezbollah militarily, and they know that the price of attempting to do so, or the price of once again destroying Lebanon, is that Israel will suffer destruction on a scale that it has never experienced before. And even if it can inflict similar damage on Lebanon, it will pay a price that I think Israel is, as of yet, not willing to contemplate. That said, It's not as if these people are master chess players, and time and again, they, through viciousness or stupidity, blunder themselves into wars with catastrophic circumstances. And there's never a guarantee that that won't happen, unfortunately.
Yeah, no. Well, as always, Ali, really appreciate your analysis on all these different fronts. And as I always say, couldn't recommend the work you all do at the Electronic Intifada any higher. But thank you so much, Ali Abunimah, for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
My pleasure. Thank you.